body. They came and told us they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see Jesus. He said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going farther. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them assembled together and saying, "It is true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon." Then the two told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. Word of God for the people of God. In your bulletin this morning is a purple sheet that looks like this. I invite you to pull that out because I'm going to have you write down some fill in the blanks in a little bit, some things I want you to remember. On the back are questions for you or for your life group to use, and then scriptures to read that will follow up on the passage on the sermon this morning. I love bread, all kinds of bread. It doesn't matter, rolls, biscuits, small loaves, big loaves, French, Italian, pita, whole wheat, even good old white. When I was a kid, it was a rare occasion that we didn't have bread, some kind of bread, with our meals. And so these diets today where you can't eat any bread, I put that in the category of cruel and unusual punishment. Did I mention that I love bread? There is nothing quite like the smell of fresh bread baking, wafting through the air. Actually, my stomach just kind of rumbled thinking about it. I even enjoy making bread. One year, early on in my ministry, I got this great idea for a family activity. We had these Wednesday family nights every week during Lent in the church. And I had the idea that the families would come together and they would make bread and we would bake it during the Bible study, and then we'd use that bread for the communion together at the end of the evening. And so the senior pastor let this crazy associate run with the idea. Everything was going great. We were doing the study and you could smell the bread baking just like I imagined, just like I hoped. And then we took the bread and we went up to the chapel and I began serving communion. Except I hadn't quite thought through the fact that the bread would still be hot and crumbly, not quite done. And I'll never forget Virgil Oxley, great name. I'll never forget Virgil Oxley coming up to receive communion. We had a little kneeler in the front and he knelt down and I gave him a piece of bread, and as he held it over the chapel, it just fell apart right into the chalice. And I'll never forget standing there and Virgil just kind of looks up at me like, "What do I do now?" I never tried to do that study again, by the way. But I love bread, and I love that bread is central to our faith as well. Bread as a symbol of the Christian faith goes back to the last night Jesus spent with his disciples. And we remember that story. We'll remember it again this morning. Every time we take communion, we remember it. But there was another time bread took center stage, and another evening meal after the resurrection. And it's a story only Luke tells. This morning we're wrapping up this series of sermons on Luke, and we focused on the least, the last, and the lost. And we're finishing this morning on the road to a town called Emmaus. It's Sunday evening, and I'm certain you remember Jesus has been arrested. He's been tried and crucified in Jerusalem. That was Friday. 3 days later, on Sunday morning, his tomb was found empty. And as Luke tells it, the women who first visited the tomb encountered angels who told them Jesus was risen. And so they hurry back to the town where the men are sleeping in, but the men don't believe the women. And to me, that always speaks a little bit to the authenticity of the account. You know, in ancient literature, if you wanted people to believe a story that you had made up, you would not have women as the first witnesses. In that culture, I'm sorry ladies, but in that culture, their testimony was not considered reliable. And so the women are not believed. And Peter goes to the tomb. Peter is left wondering what happens. He's not sure what's going on. And that's when the scene shifts in Luke's gospel to two disciples who have left Jerusalem, and they're on their way, presumably home, to a village 7 miles away from Jerusalem called Emmaus. Now, usually we assume that both of these two disciples were men, but Luke doesn't say that. Some have speculated that this might be a husband and wife who are going home to Emmaus. In John, we're told that one of the women at the cross was a woman named Mary, the wife of Clopas. Some scholars think Clopas and Cleopas could very well be the same person. So it's possible, not 100% sure, but it's possible this is Cleopas and Mary going home. And Luke says they travel and they walk this 7-mile distance and they talk the whole distance. They're discussing. The word there refers to an intense conversation, a debate. That does sound like a husband and wife conversation, doesn't it, right? Debating. They're debating what happened. And remember, they've left before any kind of confirmation of resurrection has taken place. All they know at this point is Jesus was dead. Few women have claimed that he was alive. And it's not a story that they seem to believe. And so they walk and they discuss. And then they're joined by a stranger. Luke tells us that the stranger is Jesus. But Cleopas and his companion have no idea who this is. And so the stranger joins in the discussion. Apparently there's nothing in his voice or in his mannerisms or his appearance that tips them off. In fact, he pretends to not know what's going on. And so they tell him their version, all about the events that have taken place in Jerusalem. I mean, how could he not know? How could he have been there and missed it? So as they tell the story, Cleopas utters what I think are some of the saddest words in all of Scripture. Cleopas says this, "But we had hoped that he was going to be the one to redeem Israel." We had hoped. Can you hear the longing, that the desire, even the despair in those words? We had hoped. Past tense, it's over. It's done. Hope is gone. I mean, if Jesus really was going to redeem Israel, he should have been defeating the pagans, not dying at their hands. I'm sure there's this crazy story about him being raised, but everybody knows that's not possible. Dead men don't rise. We had hoped. Now we have no hope. Can you feel the despair and the hopelessness in those words? No wonder they'd given up on Jerusalem, and they're going back home to Emmaus. And so Jesus, in his typical tactful manner, says, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe." Now that'll win friends and influence people, won't it, right? How foolish you are and how slow to believe. And then he leads them in a Bible study through apparently the whole of what we know as the Old Testament, helping them to see how all of the Jewish scriptures were pointing to him. Now can you imagine being in a Bible study like that? I mean, Jesus is teaching them the Bible. Years ago, I read a little book, small little book that had a profound impact on my life. It was called Embracing the Love of God, just 9 short chapters. But it was written in such a warm, winsome way, and I found myself deeply moved. The author was James Bryan Smith, and then I found out he's a United Methodist pastor, and some of his spiritual heroes are the same as mine. So I knew I'd found a kindred spirit. And so last fall I had the chance to travel to Wichita to hear him speak and to meet him, and I jumped at the chance because it's a great opportunity to learn directly from the author. I enjoyed my time there. And yet as great as that was, that's nothing compared to having the author of life teach you the scriptures. Jesus is teaching them the Bible. Why was nobody taking notes? Why isn't any of the content included here? The greatest Bible lesson of all time, and we don't have a single word of it. Well, they didn't take notes because they didn't know it was Jesus, right? And yet, as they will admit later, as he speaks, their hearts are burning. And that wasn't just last night's falafel. There's something in them that knows that what he's saying is true. And still they don't recognize him. And so the study goes on, 7 miles worth of study, till they get to Emmaus. The two are home, but Jesus pretends, again, he acts like he's going on until they insist that he stay with him. You know, I think that's so like Jesus. He always waits to be invited into our lives. He's not going to force his way in. But it's getting late, and the ancient code of hospitality demands that they offer him a place to stay. And so he accepts their offer and goes home with them, and they gather around the table for the evening meal. And it's not in the way he sits. It's not in the conversation around the table, not even in his preference of meals. They recognize him when he breaks the bread. Luke says Jesus took bread, gave thanks, and then offered it to them. And that's when they see him for who he really is. Why then? Well, think back about the last time bread showed up in the Gospel of Luke. It's in chapter 22, during what we know as the Last Supper, when Jesus does the same thing there that he does at Emmaus. He takes bread, he gives thanks, he breaks it, and he gives it to them. Now, what happens in Emmaus is not what we know as communion. It's just an ordinary evening meal. But there's something in the way Jesus handles the bread that reminds him of that moment, that helps him to see beyond the pretending to who he really is in their home, at their table. In the midst of the ordinary, they see Jesus. You know, Jesus tends to show up in the midst of the ordinary, what we might call the breaking of the bread. We're busy a lot of times looking for the extraordinary, and Jesus shows up when we're not looking for him in ways that we don't expect. I think about the story of Elijah, the prophet in the Hebrew Scriptures, and how he was on the run from a queen who wanted to kill him, and he's running, and he finally arrives exhausted at a cave where he can hide out. But he desperately needed to know that God was with him. And so God tells him to go to the mouth of the cave and wait for him to show up. And Elijah stands there, and there's a powerful wind, and then there's an earthquake, and then there's a fire. And after each of these spectacular and cataclysmic events, we're told the Lord wasn't in that. And after that, you remember what Elijah hears? A gentle whisper. Some of your Bibles say the still small voice. And that's where Elijah finds God's presence, in the ordinary, in the quiet whisper. It's in the midst of the ordinary that we very often find the divine. Last Sunday afternoon, we had a fantastic celebration out at Hilton Pond as 18 people were either baptized or renewed their baptismal vows. I've come to love that pond. You know, every time we gather there each year, that place becomes holy ground, but there's nothing particularly unique about it. There's nothing magical in the water, no matter how much we joke about the baptisms taking this time. It's ordinary water. It's ordinary sand. The food we share is very good, but it's ordinary food. Yet when we gather there, when we give that time to him and open our hearts to his presence, Jesus shows up in the midst of that ordinary water. Take a look at some of what happened last Sunday.
He put that hunger in your heart. He put that fire in your soul. His love is the reason to keep on believing. When you feel like giving up, when you feel like giving in, His love is the reason to keep on believing. If we could pull back the curtain of heaven, we would see His hand on everything. Every hour, every minute, every second, He's always been in it. Don't let a shadow of a doubt take hold. Hold on to what you already know. You put that hunger in your heart. You put that fire in your soul. His love is the reason to keep on believing. When you feel like giving up, when you feel like giving in, His love is the reason
I've experienced Jesus showing up in the midst of the ordinary several times in these last few months. I was thinking about our week of vacation Bible school where we powered up. And on the night we talked about Jesus' baptism, we were playing this game and we were doing some of the activities. And one of the young men in our group, just out of the blue, started asking me questions about baptism, about what it means to follow Jesus. And we know several kids that week who, in the midst of games and snacks and crafts, found Jesus showing up in their lives, and some who made a commitment to him. I think of our various mission trips and the ways the ordinary things we do in places like Detroit and Guatemala, and the team's coming back today from Guatemala. And the ordinary things that we do there help others see Jesus. I think some people are sometimes we're a little intimidated about going on a mission trip because we're afraid we'll have to stand on a street corner, and preach about Jesus. Or you have to talk about your faith every moment of the trip, and that's not the case at all. The effectiveness of those trips is found when we allow Jesus to show up through the ordinary things. We were in St. Louis this time last year. We played with the kids and we loved on them when we fixed a nice meal for single moms. We went with the kids to the zoo. We pulled weeds and helped with community gardening. They've done similar things in Guatemala and Detroit this year. And none of those things are extraordinary. But it's the love with which those things are done that allows Jesus to show up. Sometimes in unexpected ways, because Jesus is known in the ordinary things, like the breaking of the bread. He's seen in a family who steps up to the plate and, when asked on short notice, takes in a foster child. It's a complete change to a family rhythm, but they do it because they can't imagine not showing the love of Jesus to this young one. Jesus is shown when you visit a shut-in or someone who's in the hospital. You do know that's not just the job of the pastor, right? If we're truly a community of believers, caring for each other is everybody's responsibility. Jesus shows up in the ordinary ways we one another each other. And by that I mean when we follow the one another commands in the New Testament. Those are listed there on your outline. The things like submit to one another, bear with one another, forgive one another. In fact, that verse says that we're supposed to forgive in the way that the Lord forgave us. Encourage one another and build each other up. Restore one another. Accept one another. And again, this says we're to do this as Christ accepted you. Care for one another. And carry one another's burdens. That's a lot of one anothering, but I think we can sort of sum up all of those with the words of Jesus. He says, love one another as I have loved you. We love others. That's our calling. And we don't have to have extraordinary talents or abilities to do that. we love one another in ordinary, everyday ways. Think for a moment about a marriage or you knew of that lasted a long time, like 50 or 60 years. It's not the big gestures that make the difference in a relationship like that. It's the daily, simple acts of care and love that allow them to go the distance. Love is best seen in the ordinary, and the same thing is true with Jesus. He told us to one another each other. He told us that he shows up in the one another's. He's seen in the ordinary, in the breaking of the bread. And that brings us back to what I think is arguably the main focus of Luke's gospel. As I've been saying, Luke wants us to see Jesus' special concern for the least, the last, and the lost. And as they're going from Jerusalem to Emmaus, Cleopas and his companion in this story are lost. Not geographically, they're lost spiritually. They had hoped. They had wondered. They had longed for Jesus to be the one. And in the ordinary moments of a walk along a road and sharing a meal around a table, they find that Jesus is in fact the one who came to redeem not just Israel, but all of humanity. To the least, the last, and the lost, Jesus shows up in the ordinary, in the moments when we least expect him, and very often when we're not looking for him. So let me ask you, where does Jesus show up in your ordinary? Maybe the better question is, are you looking for him? Do you start each day with a prayer of holy expectancy, looking for Jesus to show up? When you get up in the morning, even if you're not a morning person, you can pray something like, Jesus, open my eyes and help me to see you working today. Or you can sing a chorus like, open my eyes, Lord, I want to see Jesus. It's amazing. When you start looking, when you start anticipating, you begin to realize he's there more than you ever knew. Because Jesus is seen and known in the breaking of the bread. I said earlier that bread became a central symbol in the Christian faith early on, not just because of this walk to Emmaus, but primarily because of that night a couple days before this. In many ways, that was just an ordinary night. It was another Passover celebration with Jesus. It was at least a third time they'd celebrated this holiday together. And for those men gathered around the table, it was a ritual they knew well. They didn't expect anything different, anything out of the ordinary, until Jesus flipped the script. Into a ritual that dated back to the beginning of their people, Jesus infused himself. The bread, his body. The wine, his blood. And suddenly, after that moment, every time they gathered around a table, every time there was bread and wine on the table, which in ancient times was every day, they would be reminded of and they would find the presence of Jesus. It's important and good and right that we celebrate this act that we call Holy Communion and that we do this regularly. But beyond this act of worship, the bread and the cup were meant to remind us that Jesus shows up in the ordinary. Whenever you gather at a table with your family or with other brothers and sisters in the faith, he's there. When you break bread, when you walk along the road, when you engage in a spirited discussion, he's there. In our relationships, broken and whole. In our church, broken and whole. In our culture, broken and whole. In every moment of every day, Christ is present. He's known in the breaking of the bread. And so with that assurance and with that promise in mind, let's gather at his table this morning to remember and to celebrate and to give thanks. Will you pray with me as we prepare our hearts for Holy Communion this morning?